pretty close for us here in chapter 1, verse 1. The days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. Josiah reigned from about 640 to 609 BC, so somewhere in that period of time is when Zephaniah is doing his work. And Josiah, I suppose if you wanted to do the work of a prophet, you might say, if you had your choice, you'd want to pick it during the days of a good king. And, well, that's the time that that Zephaniah is doing his work. Josiah is one of what's called the reformers of Judah, trying to get the people back to the law. It's under his reign, if you were to go back to 2 Kings 22 and 23. It's also recorded for us in the book of 2 Chronicles. But let's see, 2 Kings 22, this is when they're restoring the temple, and they find the book of the law, and they begin the process of, I think maybe better than reformation would be restoration. They're not trying to reform the old law. They're trying to restore it and get back to the Passover and the things that are written therein. So, 2 Kings 22 and 23, and also, let me see here, 2 Chronicles chapter 34 records the work of Josiah. One of the key phrases and this has to do with the period of time in which he was working, but one of the key phrases in Zephaniah is the day of the Lord. The first time we see it used is in chapter 1 and verse 7. The day of the Lord is at hand. Well, so if he's doing his work 640 to 609, what's getting ready to happen to Judah? Babylonian captivity. Nebuchadnezzar's coming against the land. In fact, as you're reading there in the accounts of Kings and Chronicles, during his reign and then shortly thereafter, you start reading about the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar. So we see that, and this phrase, the day of the Lord, this phrase is used throughout Scripture. And there are times such as this where it refers to a national calamity or national judgment on God's people because of, as is in this case, her sins. Sometimes it's used, well, like one time it's used in Joel and it's a prophecy of the day of Pentecost. Sometimes, and more particularly in the New Testament, it's a reference to just that, the day of the Lord, the Lord's final coming, second coming as we call it. So it's a contextual phrase is what I'm saying. You'll know by the context and who's writing and when as to what the phrase is referring to. Well, the sins of the people are obviously idolatry. Somebody read Zephaniah 1, 4, 5, and 6, please.
I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I will cut every trace of Baal from this place, the names of the idolatrous priest and the pagan priest, those who worship the host of heaven on the housetops, those who worship and swear oaths by the Lord, but who also swear by Milcom, those who have turned back from following the Lord and have not sought the Lord nor inquired of him.
Okay, now if you're looking at a King James, there in verse 4 at the end it says, I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place in the name of the Chemarims. Well, if you're reading a New King James, it's a little bit better there. Cut off the name of the pagan priests or the gods, the false gods, something along those lines. So obviously idolatry, and this is that's a continual theme throughout Israel's history as a nation, and it stems all the way back, amazingly to me, to the wilderness. You remember when Moses went up on the mountain to receive the law, what did they do? He's gone for what? 40 days. Okay, how long have these people been in captivity? 400 years. He's gone for 40 days, and they need a God to deliver them. That's just, I don't know. That's anyway, that's Exodus 32. That account just always blows my mind. That Aaron should have known better. Absolutely. And then what he did when he was called out on it, what did he do? Well, the people, he shifted the blame. That seems to be a historical problem for mankind. So you've got idolatry, but then complacency. Somebody read chapter 1 and verse 12, please.
And it shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish the men who are settled in complacency, who say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do evil.
Okay. The King James says, settled on their lees, settled in their complacency. I like that a little bit better. The Lord's not going to do anything. He won't do good or bad. Another prophet, let me see here real quick. I believe it's Amos. Amos talks about this, in chapter 6. If you remember, when we went through Amos. Amos, now he's let's just say, round it off, about approximately 150 years before Zephaniah. But you remember, Amos talked about those who were at ease in Zion. So again, this seems to be a continuing theme, because really up to, well, not quite all the way up to the Babylonian captivity, but in the days of Amos and Isaiah, Israel is at what we call its zenith, its highest point of political power, wealth, and things like this. And so the people become complacent, and now this is, again, approximately 150 years later, and they're complacent. And that's always a danger for God's people, to be satisfied with where we are, and not in any reference to change or anything like that, but thinking in modern terms of what we do in a local congregation. Lights are on, bills are paid. We're not having any major issues. We're happy with who's here. We've got a good number. And we can just coast along and be satisfied with where we are. That's complacency. Well, if you do that long enough, what's the future of a congregation going to be? You're just happy where you are. Like right now, we've got several young couples and young children, and man, that's exciting, and that really is great. But if we're just complacent and we don't do anything to spread the gospel, because, hey, we're meeting budget. I mean, calm down. Everything's okay. Where's the church going to be in? Because we're happy right now and things are going well right now, but where's the church going to be in, let's say, 20 years when these little toddlers are 25 or so? It's not just about right now. We've got to be thinking about the future, and not in terms of just looking at the future, but our work in a community is to influence the community. It's not to run a business. The church is not a business, and it shouldn't be run like a business. And we can become complacent with where we are and satisfied, and that nothing good ever comes of that. Let's just say it that way. It's kind of like Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2. You've left your first love. It's not necessarily that you're doing anything wicked or that you're tolerating error or anything like that. It's just you're going through the motions, and well, eventually that's going to run out too. So complacency has been a problem of God's people for some time. Any questions or comments on anything we've said so far? Lack of interest, yeah, and a variety of things. Complacency congregationally could be the things I was talking about. Individual Christians can become complacent. Yeah, I know enough. I don't really need to come to Bible class. I've got that stuff down. Just the self-sufficient, self-satisfied, coast along mentality can be a congregational problem, but it can also be an individual problem. And that's a dangerous place to be. Well, let's go to 2 Kings 23 real quick. Let's look at this. One of the things that we read in Zephaniah. And of course, this is looking forward, as Zephaniah is writing, looking forward to Babylonian captivity. But in Zephaniah's day, you have, again, Josiah as king, and he is one of the restorer kings, if you want to use that terminology. And so he deals with idolatry himself. Again, they find the book of the law as they're refurbishing the temple. Somebody read 2 Kings 23, verses 3 through 6, please. Is that 2 Kings 23? Isn't it? Well, what am I looking at? What did I say? What verses did I tell you to read? 3 through 6. You're doing great. Keep reading. Well, I apologize for interrupting you then. The brook Kidron that you read about a couple times there it's just a tributary into the Jordan River down south. And so we're reading about God's people here, all right, and this process of restoration, and what Derek was reading there, particularly in verse 4. The images of Baal, the grove. The grove is like they would build little sites of worship around cities and stuff where you could go, and typically on a hill, so you'd be closer to the heavens. They made those for the host of heaven. They have all these priests. You look at verse 5, they burned incense unto Baal. Listen to this, to the sun, the moon. The King James says planets. The New King James says the constellations. They're worshiping the host of heaven. And, you know, we're not talking about the Ninevites here or anybody like that. We're talking about the Jewish people who had the law. So this problem, again, of idolatry that we've already talked about a bit, it's, you know, when they conquered the Promised Land, that's one of the things that they were told to do. You utterly drive out the inhabitants of that land, because if you don't, they're going to be a thorn in your side, and you're going to start worshiping their gods. And don't intermarry with those people, because if you do, you're going to go after their gods. Of course, really, I guess Solomon kind of set the standard for that, didn't he? Marrying all those foreign women and building houses for them and then building shrines for their gods. And so this has been a problem for them for hundreds of years, you might say. And so Zephaniah is doing his work as Josiah is doing this. But idolatry is still the problem. Now, ultimately, when they go into Babylonian captivity, they are cleansed of that problem. And they move from idolatry to ritualism. And that's where we have, you know, after the captivity and what we call the intertestament period, that's when you see these groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, evolving over time. They've left the idols behind, but now they install their own traditions. And they begin to you might say, bow down to their traditions, and Jesus has to deal with that. And so this has been a centuries-long problem, but God would deal with their idolatry. And He, again, addresses that, going back now to Zephaniah here in chapter 1. All of this is going to happen in the day of the Lord. And that, of course, is a reference to Babylonian captivity.
So did they think they created the idols that they worshiped,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Like Baal.
Well, these are foreign gods too. Like the Molech and Baal, those are foreign deities. Ashtaroth, that they adopted. I guess that's the best way to say it.
Those were gods, and they just chose to worship them instead of the God.
Let's look at that. Let's go to 2 Kings 17, because this kind of answers that question. Yes. One of them. But yes. 2 Kings 17. Somebody read 32 and 33, please.
So they feared the Lord and made unto themselves of the lowest of them, priests of the high places would sacrifice for them in the houses of the high places. They feared the Lord and served their own gods after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from thence. How far did you say?
That's good. I was looking at verse 34 too. Unto this day they do after the former manners. They fear not the Lord, neither do they after their statutes, or after their ordinances, or after the law and commandment which the Lord commanded them. So, but you notice there, they feared Jehovah, all right, and served their own gods. Well, these were the gods of the nations whom they carried away from thence. Again, you go back to I guess you might say the process really started with the failures of the post-Joshua generation, not driving out the inhabitants as they should. Then you have the problem of intermarriage with the Canaanites, as Tristan pointed out, and it just becomes a mixture of all of their gods. And they feared Jehovah, but they served. They do what?
So they believed in him, they feared him.
Yes, they feared Jehovah.
But what did serving those or worshiping those gods, how did that benefit them?
People that they didn't run out. That's how they got along with it better.
Yeah.
They adopted a lot of the practices.
Well, that's certainly true.
It looks like they would have just been content to not worship anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, that's what I was saying earlier with Moses going up in the mountain for 40 days. What do? They build a golden calf and worship it. Yeah, but they came out of Egypt. Well, what did they see in Egypt? They saw idolatry. You can leave the Bible out of that discussion and go look historically, secularly at Egypt and see that they were a polytheistic society. And all of these surrounding nations, Philistines, the Canaanites, all of these nations that are frequently listed are all polytheistic. And even in some of the battles, and I can't remember the text right now, I think they were fighting Syria. But they talk about the gods of the hills and the gods of the plains. Their God is a God of one of those regions, so let's drive them to the other and we'll defeat them there. Well, Israel, over time and through exposure, adopted that same thing. But that's what God warned them against. That was the danger of compromising with those foreign nations. That's why when you go back to Deuteronomy 7, God tells them very specifically, you don't make any covenants with those people. Because if you do, you'll forsake me and you'll worship their gods. And that's exactly what happened. But 2 Kings 17 really lays that out.
How long
But-
did that go on? Are there still people in the world who, like, I know we have a bunch of different religions. And when I
Yeah.
say religions, I mean like,
Well, there are some world religions that predate even Christianity. It's just, that's the way it's always been. I don't really know how to summarize it good, I guess, summarize it well, but there are still polytheistic societies. I forget, I spoke at Memphis, I think it was last May, and one of the speakers spoke on Hinduism. And, oh man, the innumerable, if I'm not mistaken, like millions, the number was in the millions of gods that Hinduism has. Yeah, so polytheism is alive and well. There's no question about that. But with Israel, it was adopted because they failed to do what God told them to do as they entered the land and drive out the inhabitants.
Did they have more of a desire to worship then than what we do now, as far as the world as a whole?
Maybe. It may be kind of like Athens in Acts 17. Paul's, he looked at all their idols and he said, I see that you are very religious. A lot of people say today, well, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. Well, that's a whole other subject, but it seems that, well, we'll all worship something. Typically I think we confine worship to what we do in this building, but, the fact of the matter is, the way the Bible presents it, anything you put before God becomes your idol. That's what you bow down and serve. Although you may not be physically prostrating yourself on the ground before it, that's what you serve. Not as far as I know. Yeah, well, that's just it. It's hard to understand because they knew, well, if they had kept the law like they were supposed to do, and that's what's going on in Josiah's day. They didn't even know where the law was. They found it as they're redoing the temple. They would have known there's no benefit to that. So the prophets do that a lot. Particularly Isaiah deals with that. Isaiah, about chapters 40 through 44, goes into great detail about the futility of idolatry. And the example he uses is a guy goes, he cuts down a tree. What does he do with the tree? He makes a god. He warms himself, and he cooks his supper. And what are you doing? I mean, that is by breaking it down that way. You carve this piece of wood that's over here. You're taking care of your domestic needs, and over here you're carving it to make it look like you want it to look, and then you bow down to that? It's like, you might say, trying to give them a wake-up call to the stupidity of what they were doing, because that's exactly what it was. Well, whatever we worship, whatever we place before God, isn't that really the same thing? How dull can you be to do that kind of stuff and put other things before God? Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
This would be a whole lot different than today. If you move to a certain place in this country, you just almost have to compromise if you want to go to church, to a true church of Christ. There's places you can't find that.
Yeah.
And you just, if you really want to go to church, you'd settle for someone else. If you wanted to live with and get along with the community, but you could, unless you started your own congregation of your family or something, because there's places, I've been a few places you can't find a church.
Yeah. Well, that's what you'd have to do. It's either that or compromise. Which is it going to be? And, we're used to, in this particular region where we live, we're used to having a congregation that's robust and active, sound. You're right, there are places all over this country that you will not find that. So what do? Well, you certainly don't compromise. You may have to start. Do what?
That's what these people.
Oh, yeah.
The Jews were compromising because they wanted to get along with the people that they should have run away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And killed or whatever.
Well, it wasn't just religiously either. They were making political alliances all over the place, trying to spare themselves, and that was against God's law too. Yeah, so it's either compromise I guess what it is, you do it God's way, you compromise, or you don't do anything. You know, which is the best option?
Going back to Moses' day, what did Pharaoh worship?
Everything. The gods of Egypt.
They were polytheistic.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of gods. Okay, so where does the power come? You know, I know this isn't what we're talking about now, but it's always bothered me. I know that when his rod became a snake, it devoured the other one. How did that other rod become a snake? You know what I mean? Like, Satan's got to be involved in this.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So is it like they're worshiping Satan?
Well, from their perspective, no. But they were magicians. You have to remember that. They were sorcerers. They had tricks.
But it really did become a snake, didn't it?
Yes. But it probably wasn't a rod before then. They had tricks. I did a whole series of videos on this because one of the statements that's made in Exodus 12 is when the 10 plagues come, God said, I'm going to pass judgment on all the gods of Egypt. And when you look at all the signs that were used, you can actually trace it back. The 10 plagues, the serpents, the blood to water, you can trace every one of those plagues back to a specific Egyptian god in history. Just because they worshipped it as a god didn't mean that they had that power. It's like 2 Thessalonians 2 talks about people who are deluded and would believe a lie. And the reason stated there in 2 Thessalonians 2 is because they didn't receive the love of the truth. And if you don't love the truth, you'll buy into anything. So, if you go to our YouTube channel, I've got a whole series of videos on all the gods of Egypt. It's pretty interesting when you dig into that, and I'm sure somebody could do a lot better job than I did. But
Knowing that they had a snake in the beginning, they were just trying to fool everyone else, is what you're saying.
yeah, that's, I mean, we still have magicians today who can deceive, and rather convincingly. But the power is not with them, it's a trick. So, and that was one of the things specifically with the rod to a serpent. What happened to their serpents? Moses' serpents ate them up. So, because they could do a trick didn't mean that they truly had a power from Ra, the sun god, or something like that. But yeah, the Egyptians, man, they had a god for everything. They had a god for the sun, the moon, the stars, the ground, serpents, beetles. They worshipped beetles, the river, the blood to water. That was a strike against the gods of Egypt because they worshipped the river. Anyway, Israel's affected by all this throughout her history because they have compromised. Chapter 2, back to Zephaniah now. Chapter 2 deals with the surrounding nations, and he lists quite a few. And as you look at chapter 2 and verse 2, he talks about the day of the Lord's anger. Well, the day of the Lord's anger applies to all of these foreign nations as well. And they are subject to God just like the nation of Judah is. Look at verse 11, Zephaniah 2:11. The Lord will be terrible unto them. You see that a few times in your King James Old Testament. The Lord is terrible. And the modern versions do a better job with that. He's awesome. And awesome is not the word of, that young people use sometimes. That's awesome. Awesome means he is, when you observe him and you see his activity, you are full of awe because of his power. And so the day of the Lord against the nations, it's going to be awe-inspiring, you might say. That's what awesome means. That's what terrifying means. When God is going to be terrible, that's what it means. Another problem, you get into chapter 3, the leaders are corrupt. Well, that's been a historically major problem. Woe to her that is filthy and polluted, to the oppressing city. She obeyed not, the King James says the voice. The New King James says his voice, and that's who we're talking about. She obeyed not God's voice. It's talking about Jerusalem. She didn't receive correction. She trusted not in the Lord. She drew not near to her God. Well, what are they doing? They're drawing near to all these other gods, and they're making political alliances all around them. And so, well, her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves. They're predators. They're predatory. Her prophets are light. They're reckless. They've polluted the sanctuary. They've done violence to the law. But you know what verse 5 says? The just Lord sees it all. God knows exactly what's going on, and He's going to deal with it. Chapter 3, verses 8 to 13, God's furious judgment would lead to some good. Suffering, as they were going to endure for 70 years, it led to some good. And suffering can produce some good things if we respond correctly to the suffering that we face. So they're told to wait for the Lord. Chapter 3 and verse 8. Wait ye upon me, saith the Lord. Well, to wait on God means to place your trust in Him and to do what He says do. That's what it means. The book ends with a promise, a promise of national restoration. Of course, that's post-captivity. The people are brought back and things like that, but you do have that message of hope. One interesting thing that I found, and I put it in here, is in chapter 3 and verse 9. And this is talking about after God's judgment, after the captivity and all that. It says, "For then will I turn to the people a pure language." So, let's go to Nehemiah real quick, chapter 13. And I think there are two ways that you could look at this. I'm not saying that this is for certain exactly what Zephaniah is talking about, but I kind of lean this way because of what we read in Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah, of course, is post-exilic. He's after the exile, restoration of the temple, and all of that. Nehemiah 13:23. In those days also I saw Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. So they've intermarried among the nations, which they were not to do. Look, and their children spoke half the speech of Ashdod and could not speak in the Jewish language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them and cursed them and smote certain of them and plucked off their hair and made them swear by God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons for yourselves." Didn't Solomon lead Israel astray like that? So they repeated their history over and over again, and it got to the point where some of them couldn't even speak the language. Well, if you can't speak the language, what are you going to do with the written law? Not much, because you don't speak the language. So I wondered in Zephaniah 3:9 if that might be a prophetic looking towards what would happen in Nehemiah's day, as Nehemiah dealt with that. Any questions or comments on anything else? Mm. Yep. That's it. And again, that goes all the way back to the wilderness, doesn't it? You know, man, if we'd only died in Egypt, we'd at least died, we had food. They're complaining the whole time. So, and what was that? That would be about, let me think real quick. Be about 800 years or 900 years before all this. So this problem has spanned centuries with them. Anybody else?
Do you think we see the pagan influences in our, like, the way we live today? And what I mean by that is we have traditions like Christmas and Easter and even birthdays that originated as pagan holidays that we kind of incorporated into our lives, even though we don't believe that they are
Yeah.
Christian holidays.
Yeah, there's no disputing that. That there's a lot of pagan, well, think of the days of the week. Sunday, where did those names come from? But those being what they are doesn't mean that we are, as you said, acknowledging the pagan origins of those things. But yeah, it's paganism has been an influence all around the world. You could almost say forever.
I know in the first century, a lot of the early Christians rejected
Well, I know some today that do, even within the church. And that's okay. You know, that would fall under Romans 14 and the idea of scruples. You know, if it bothers your conscience, then don't celebrate your birthday. Nothing wrong with that. And I'm not going to judge you for that, but you can't judge me for, you know, having celebrated my birthday, which was yesterday. And thank you all. I got some nice cards and stuff, so I appreciate that. But yeah, there's no doubt that there is a paganistic influence in society. Okay, guys, so next week is Haggai. You've got 2 chapters. And I won't be here next week, so hold off on that. All right, appreciate your attention. Is that how that works? You don't get any older, huh?